Nancy Pelosi's voice, sharp and deliberate, cut through the hall like a blade. With a dismissive flick of her hand, she delivered the words that would echo across America. "Go back to school." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The insult hung in the air, dripping with condescension, its weight pressing down on everyone present. It wasn't just a jab at Jasmine Crockett. It was an attempt to reduce her, to belittle her intelligence, to remind her and every viewer watching of who was meant to hold power and who was meant to stay silent. Eyes darted around the room. Some widened in disbelief. Others, accustomed to this brand of arrogance, lowered in shame. The sting of the insult wasn't confined to Crockett alone. It rippled outward, felt by every young woman who had been told she was too inexperienced, every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, every person of color who had been told to know their place. Cameras zoomed in. Crockett sat still, her posture unbroken, her expression unreadable calm, composed, unshaken. But beneath that calm, there was a storm waiting to break. Around her the whispers began to swell. Reporters scribbled frantically, and social media lit up in real time. Viewers at home leaned forward, stunned, replaying the moment to be sure they had heard it right. Pelosi leaned back in her chair, confident, satisfied, believing she had ended the exchange with one cutting remark. For decades, that kind of casual dismissal had silenced countless voices. But what Pelosi failed to realize was that this time was different. This was not an era where insults faded into the air. This was an era of instant replays, viral clips, and a generation unwilling to bow their heads. The stage was set, the air electric. A single insult had transformed a routine proceeding into a battlefield of dignity versus arrogance. And as the cameras stayed fixed on Crockett, waiting, the nation held its breath. But no one expected the calm yet thunderous response that would turn the room and the country upside down. The confrontation did not happen in a vacuum. That day in Congress, the air was already charged with tension. The kind of tension that arises when generations collide, when old guard politics clashes with the restless urgency of a new America. The debate on the floor had been heated, circling around issues that cut deep into the country's conscience, questions of justice, equity, and who truly represents the people's voice. Pelosi, the seasoned architect of political machinery, carried herself as though the chamber still belonged entirely to her era. She had weathered decades of storms, outmaneuvered rivals, and wielded authority with an iron hand. To her supporters, she was a master strategist, but to many, especially those watching closely in that moment, she embodied something else: the arrogance of entrenched power. The kind of power that forgets its roots and looks down upon those who dare to rise. Jasmine Crockett was not meant to be silenced so easily. She stood as a voice of a new generation, younger, sharper, unapologetically bold. She carried into that chamber the weight of communities who had been ignored for too long, voices that demanded not just to be heard, but to be respected. Every word she spoke that day was more than political argument. It was an assertion of identity, of belonging, of refusal to be diminished. That is why Pelosi's insult struck like a lightning bolt. Go back to school. It wasn't just a dismissal of Crockett's words. It was a dismissal of her very place at the table. It was the kind of insult laced with centuries of subtext that the young must wait their turn, that women of color must prove themselves twice over, that dignity and intelligence are only granted when the powerful decide to bestow it. For viewers at home, the scene was painful and familiar. It echoed every boardroom where a woman's idea was mocked until a man repeated it, every classroom where a student of color was underestimated, every workplace where someone was told they weren't polished enough, educated enough, worthy enough. The insult was not just Pelosi versus Crockett. It was establishment versus insurgent, past versus future, entitlement versus earned struggle. And in that chamber, Pelosi believed she had reasserted her dominance. She believed she had reminded Crockett of her place, reminded the room who had the final word. But the cameras did not lie, and neither did the silence that followed. Across the country, people watching knew something seismic had shifted. What Pelosi intended as a silencing blow had instead amplified the stakes. It made the moment larger than herself, larger than Crockett. It became a question of what kind of leadership America would accept in the years to come. The insult became a symbol, the spark in dry timber. In that moment, Pelosi unknowingly lit a fire she could not control. Because what she had underestimated, what entrenched power so often underestimates, was the unshakable resolve of those who carry entire generations behind them. The silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence before the storm. America leaned closer, waiting for the clap of thunder. And just when Pelosi thought she had ended the conversation, Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth. To understand the weight of that insult, to grasp why it reverberated so deeply, you have to understand Nancy Pelosi herself. For decades, she has been a towering figure in American politics, the first woman to hold the Speaker's gavel, a master tactician who outmaneuvered opponents with relentless precision, and a symbol of establishment power. Her career was built on iron discipline and a knack for consolidating control. To many, Pelosi embodied stability in turbulent times. But with stability came a darker shadow, the entitlement of entrenched authority, and the belief that new voices were less an evolution and more a nuisance. Pelosi's rise was historic, no question. She shattered ceilings that once seemed unbreakable, moving through the ranks of a system dominated almost entirely by men. But over time, that story of triumph began to warp. She became not just a survivor of the system, but its protector. She enforced loyalty with ruthless efficiency, rewarding those who fell in line, sidelining those who dared to question her authority. It was a political empire she had built brick by brick. But like any empire, its foundations were cemented in hierarchy, in deference, in the unspoken rule that those who came before always knew best. And that is where her contradictions revealed themselves. Pelosi was celebrated for championing diversity, for speaking of inclusion and empowerment. Yet time and again, she dismissed the very voices that sought to carry those values into the future. Younger lawmakers who refused to play by the old scripts often found themselves patronized, diminished, or ignored. To her, experience was the ultimate currency, and she wielded it as a weapon. That is what made her insult to Jasmine Crockett so telling. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment jab. It was the culmination of years of a mindset that viewed challenges from the new generation as bothersome interruptions to the carefully curated narrative she controlled. Go back to school wasn't about education. It was about authority. It was Pelosi reminding the chamber and the country that she, the veteran, the insider, the legend of the Democratic establishment, still claimed ownership of the stage. Her career had always carried this duality. On the one hand, she represented progress, a woman in power, a barrier breaker, a symbol of what was possible. On the other, she became a gatekeeper, deciding who was ready to lead, who was polished enough to be taken seriously, who was permitted to speak on behalf of the people. That contradiction turned her from a trailblazer into an obstacle. Consider her posture during debates. The controlled smirk, the pointed finger, the well-practiced tone of someone accustomed to having the final word. She had become an expert in the language of dismissal, not with fiery anger, but with a cool condescension that left opponents feeling small. For years it worked. Colleagues backed down. Critics tempered their words. Reporters wrote about her command of the chamber. But times had changed. What once appeared as strength now looked like arrogance. What once passed as discipline now read as elitism. A new generation, one that valued authenticity over polish, that valued lived experience over pedigreed hierarchy, had grown tired of being told to wait their turn. Pelosi's remarks that day became the embodiment of that clash, not simply a clash of personalities, but a clash of eras. Her legacy, though formidable, was now tinged with contradiction. Yes, she fought for healthcare reform. Yes, she stood against Trump's chaos. Yes, she had been a strategist without equal. But those victories could not erase the moments when she sought to silence her own side, when she diminished rather than elevated, when her authority became less about service and more about control. And so, In that chamber, her insult to Crockett carried more than just personal sting. It became symbolic of the very gatekeeping that so many Americans had grown weary of. It became the sharp edge of elitism laid bare for all to see. In her words, people heard not just Pelosi's voice, but the echo of every entrenched figure who had told them they weren't enough, weren't ready, didn't belong. Pelosi believed her shadow still stretched across the nation, that her words could silence as they once had. But she underestimated the moment, underestimated the woman sitting before her, underestimated the millions watching who had long grown tired of arrogance masquerading as wisdom. Her career had made her a giant, but giants can stumble. And on that day, Pelosi's long shadow was about to meet a force she couldn't have predicted. Before the moment that would electrify the chamber, Jasmine Crockett's story had already been years in the making. Hers is not the tale of privilege or political grooming, but of grit forged in fire, of a woman who clawed her way from the courtroom trenches to the halls of Congress, carrying with her the voices of those who rarely make it past the velvet ropes of power. She began not with headlines, but with cases no one else wanted. As a defense attorney, she stood beside the accused who couldn't afford a voice. She walked into courtrooms where young men of color were treated like foregone conclusions, where poverty was put on trial alongside people. And in those rooms, she fought. Case after case, she built a reputation not for compromise, but for courage. Judges raised their eyebrows at her audacity. Prosecutors bristled at her fire. But the people she defended, often forgotten, often discarded, saw something rare. They saw someone who would not back down. It was never about ambition alone. Crockett's drive was born of lived experience, of watching systems designed to exclude, of feeling firsthand how hard it was to push through doors that others waltzed through effortlessly. She carried those scars, not as burdens, but as armor. Every time someone told her, "You don't belong here," she sharpened her resolve. Every slight became fuel. Every obstacle, another reason to keep walking forward. When she stepped into politics, she brought that same energy, raw, unfiltered, unapologetic. She didn't smooth her edges to fit in. She didn't soften her tone to make others comfortable. She entered the Texas House with the same fire she wielded in the courtroom, unafraid to call out hypocrisy, unafraid to raise her voice when silence was demanded. And it was precisely that fearlessness that catapulted her onto the national stage. Her rise to Congress wasn't inevitable. It was improbable. She wasn't backed by the full machinery of establishment power. She wasn't a hand-picked favorite of the party elite. Instead, she was propelled forward by communities who recognized themselves in her fight-working families, young activists, immigrants who saw in her story the struggle of proving worth in a country that too often withholds recognition. Jasmine Crockett became more than a politician. She became a symbol. In her, people saw the unapologetic truth-teller, the advocate who did not hide behind rehearsed lines or polished platitudes. She didn't just speak, she testified. She embodied the frustration and hope of a generation that had grown tired of waiting, tired of being silenced, tired of hearing promises without seeing results. Her presence in Congress was not quiet. Almost immediately, she drew attention for her fiery exchanges, her relentless questioning, her refusal to bow to protocol when protocol was designed to stifle. She became the kind of figure who either intimidated or inspired, depending on which side of her conviction you stood. For her supporters, she was refreshing proof that politics could still carry the rawness of truth. For her detractors, she was too much, a familiar refrain hurled at women who refused to shrink themselves. And through it all, Crockett never apologized for who she was. She leaned into her identity as a black woman, as a defender of the marginalized, as someone who refused to know her place. She carried that identity into every exchange, into every fight, because she knew that her very existence in those chambers was an act of defiance against the systems that never meant for her to be there. This was the crucible that prepared her for Pelosi's insult. Years of being underestimated had taught her patience. Years of being dismissed had taught her precision. Years of defending the voiceless had taught her the art of turning an attack into a rallying cry. She had been told before to sit down, to wait her turn, to go back and learn more code words meant to disguise exclusion as advice. But every time she had risen, every time she had sharpened her skills, waiting for the moment when her voice could not only defend herself, but stand as a mirror for millions watching. So when Pelosi leaned back, smug in her dismissal, Jasmine Crockett did not shrink. She did not flinch. She had seen this play before in courtrooms, in political halls, in everyday interactions that demanded she justify her presence, and she knew exactly what to do. This was no ordinary exchange. This was not just Pelosi versus Crockett. This was history crashing into the present. It was the voice of the establishment colliding with the voice of the future. And Crockett, with her armor of experience, with her fire honed in battle, was uniquely prepared to meet it. Her story had always been one of resilience, but resilience was only the foundation. What came next would elevate her beyond resilience into something greater. A defining moment of dignity, a response so sharp, so undeniable, that it would transform a casual insult into a national reckoning. All of these battles had prepared her for this one explosive moment. The chamber had grown restless, the energy shifting with each exchange. Pelosi's words carried the weight of decades in power, sharp, dismissive, steeped in the authority of someone accustomed to being the final voice in the room. Every sentence she delivered was laced with a subtle condescension, the kind that does not shout but sneers, the kind that seeks to remind everyone listening of rank and hierarchy. Crockett, by contrast, sat with measured composure. She did not rise to every barb. She did not mirror Pelosi's tone. Instead, she responded with a steadiness that only deepened the contrast. Her words were clear, her tone unwavering, her focus precise. In every pause, she allowed Pelosi's interruptions to expose themselves for what they were: not wisdom, but arrogance. The back and forth unfolded like a storm gathering over open waters. Pelosi jabbed with practiced disdain, rolling her eyes, shaking her head, brushing off Crockett's points as if they were the musings of a novice. She invoked her years of experience, her record, her authority. Each jab was designed to diminish, to re-establish dominance, to make clear that this chamber still belonged to her generation. But Crockett countered not with aggression, but with calm force. Each time Pelosi tried to interrupt, she waited, then continued with even sharper precision, her words slicing through the noise. Her restraint became its own power, an unsettling reminder that confidence need not shout. She spoke not only for herself, but for those watching, for every person who had ever felt dismissed in the face of arrogance. Around them, colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Some leaned forward, sensing the storm building. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. The tension was palpable. Reporters scribbled, cameras zoomed, microphones captured every nuance of tone. Viewers at home could feel it. This was no ordinary debate. This was two Americas colliding, the establishment clinging to dominance, and the future demanding space. Pelosi's frustration began to show. The smirk grew tighter, the interruptions sharper. She tried to use laughter as a weapon, the familiar tactic of trivializing an opponent rather than engaging them. But Crockett refused to take the bait. She pressed forward, her arguments clear, her composure intact. Each measured response drew the contrast sharper. Arrogance against dignity, dismissal against resolve. The storm reached its breaking point as Pelosi, rattled by Crockett's refusal to yield, leaned closer. Her voice carried not just irritation but something darker, the impatience of a figure unaccustomed to being challenged, the anger of someone who believed authority should never be questioned. The room fell into a strained silence. Cameras captured the narrowing of Pelosi's eyes, the slight curl of her lips, the gesture of finality that had silenced so many before. Crockett sat steady, her gaze unbroken, waiting. And then, the insult that would echo across the nation. Pelosi leaned in and spat, "Go back to school." For a moment, the insult hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Go back to school. The words carried all the weight Pelosi intended, dismissive, final, a command meant to shrink Jasmine Crockett into silence. But the silence that followed was not compliance. It was the silence of anticipation, of something about to shift. The chamber itself seemed to lean forward, waiting for what would come next. Crockett inhaled slowly, her posture still composed, her eyes fixed on Pelosi with unshaken calm. She didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't scramble to defend herself as so many might have. Instead, she allowed the weight of Pelosi's words to reveal their own arrogance. And then, with a steady voice that cut sharper than any shout, she began, "Madam Speaker, with all due respect," she said, her tone controlled yet ringing with clarity, "I did not come to this chamber to play student to anyone's lecture. I came here elected by the people, by working families, by mothers and fathers, by young people who are sick of being told their voices don't matter. I came here to fight for them, not to be dismissed by someone who has forgotten what it means to be underestimated." The chamber stirred, heads turned, some jaws tightened, others loosened in awe. Pelosi's smirk faltered just slightly, the first crack in her mask of authority. Crockett pressed on, her words gathering momentum like a wave rising. "I've spent my life in courtrooms, defending those who didn't have the privilege of power at their fingertips. I've looked into the eyes of young black men told they'd never get a fair shot, of immigrants told to go back where they came from, of women told to sit down and be quiet, and every single time I have stood up and said, no, they belong here. Their voices matter. And let me make this clear today, so does mine." The room fell into absolute stillness. Even those who had grown accustomed to Pelosi's dominance couldn't look away. Crockett's voice had taken the insult and turned it outward, transforming a personal slight into a collective rallying cry. Pelosi shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing, but Crockett wasn't finished. Her voice grew stronger, not louder, but deeper, each word delivered with the weight of lived truth. "If the standard of belonging here is education, then let's talk about what we've learned. Because I have learned, through struggle, that justice doesn't come easy. I've learned that dignity must be defended. And I've learned that experience doesn't give anyone the right to dismiss another human being." Gasps rippled softly through the chamber. Pelosi's allies shifted uneasily, sensing the tide turning. Crockett's allies, though silent, wore the faintest traces of pride on their faces, their eyes gleaming as if to say, "This is the moment." And then Crockett leaned in, just slightly, her gaze unwavering. "So no, Madam Speaker, I will not go back to school. I will not be diminished, not by you, not by anyone. Because my classroom has been the courtroom. My teachers have been the people who sent me here. And my diploma is the trust of those who know that my fight is their fight. That is my credential. That is my qualification. And that is why I belong here." The chamber erupted, not in applause. Decorum still held that back, but in the kind of audible energy that cannot be contained. Murmurs grew, reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed in to catch Pelosi's tightened jaw, the slight twitch of irritation she could not mask. For once, the legend of control, the icon of establishment dominance, looked unsettled. Crockett wasn't finished. She had found her rhythm, her cadence building into something unforgettable. "We cannot, as a nation, afford to confuse experience with entitlement. We cannot confuse tenure with truth. And we cannot let arrogance masquerade as wisdom. If anything, what this country needs is not more gatekeepers, but more voices, young voices, bold voices, voices that reflect the reality of America today. That is why I am here. That is why I will stay." Her words landed like thunder, shaking the chamber, reverberating beyond its walls. For those watching at home, the moment felt like vindication, a cathartic release. Viewers who had felt dismissed in their own lives suddenly saw themselves reflected in Crockett's defiance. The student told she wasn't smart enough. The worker told they weren't qualified. The immigrant told to go back. All found their dignity reclaimed in her voice. Pelosi sat rigid, her lips pursed, her gaze fixed but unsteady. For decades, she had wielded dismissiveness like a weapon, silencing opponents with a flick of her hand. But here, before millions of eyes, that weapon had failed. Crockett had taken it, turned it, and used it to strike a blow not just against Pelosi, but against the very elitism she embodied. The cameras captured every beat. Pelosi's face tightening, Crockett's expression steady. The ripple of stunned silence that filled the air. Online, the moment was already being clipped, tweeted, shared. Hashtags formed in seconds. Abrish go back to school? No. She belongs began to trend, echoing Crockett's refrain that her qualification came not from establishment approval, but from the people themselves. For those in the chamber, it felt as though they were witnessing not just a rebuttal, but a transformation. Crockett had shifted from being the target of dismissal to the author of her own narrative. She had turned insult into anthem, arrogance into exposure. And as she leaned back in her chair, her composure unbroken, the chamber buzzed with the weight of what had just happened. The insult that was meant to diminish her had instead elevated her, carving her name into the political consciousness of the nation. Pelosi tried to regain her footing, but the moment had already slipped beyond her grasp. The narrative was no longer hers to control. The torch, if only for that instant, had passed. And yet, even as the chamber tried to settle, even as Pelosi adjusted her papers and the gavel struck for order, everyone knew this was not the end. The ripple was just beginning, the shockwave already moving beyond those walls. Because what had just happened was bigger than a debate, bigger than a chamber exchange. It was a spark, a viral ignition, a moment destined to live far beyond the transcripts. But the fireworks didn't stop there. America itself was about to weigh in. The moment the words left Jasmine Crockett's lips, they were no longer confined to the chamber. Within seconds, phones lit up across the nation. Clips of her rebuttal were replayed, shared, and dissected, spreading across social media with wildfire speed. What Pelosi thought would be a crushing put-down had instead become the seed of a viral storm that no one could ignore. Hashtags erupted instantly. She belongs. Mic drop moment. She'sh go back to school. The latter transformed from insult to ironic badge of honor. Twitter feeds overflowed with users writing, "Crockett just schooled Pelosi, and she didn't even need to raise her voice." TikTok edits appeared within minutes, soundtracking Crockett's words with booming music, zoom effects, and flashing captions. The most replayed clip was that calm, steady line, "My diploma is the trust of those who know my fight is their fight." It was quoted, memed, stitched, and remixed until it became less a sentence and more a rallying cry. Late-night hosts cracked jokes about Pelosi's lecture gone wrong. Comedians dubbed the exchange Pelosi's pop quiz, and Crockett aced it. Memes flooded timelines. Pelosi's face photoshopped onto a chalkboard, teacher scrawling, "Go back to school," while Crockett stood triumphant with a stack of books labeled Truth, Justice, Dignity. The internet laughed, but beneath the humor there was something sharper, a collective recognition that a torch had been passed, if only symbolically, in that moment. Celebrities chimed in too. Musicians tweeted lyrics inspired by Crockett's words. Actors applauded her dignity. Influencers across platforms declared, "This is why representation matters." Politicians were forced to respond, some hedging carefully to avoid Pelosi's wrath, others openly praising Crockett for refusing to be silenced. Younger lawmakers, especially women and people of color, posted their solidarity. "We've all heard it before. We've all been dismissed. Jasmine said what we've been carrying for years." News cycles couldn't resist. Networks replayed the exchange on loop, framing it as the clash of generations. Panelists debated whether Pelosi had gone too far, whether Crockett's calm response signaled the rise of a new power dynamic inside the party. For once, the establishment wasn't dictating the narrative. Crockett was. And while Pelosi's defenders tried to downplay it, calling it a misunderstanding or a throwaway line, the damage was done. The public had already seized on the symbolism. It wasn't about whether Pelosi meant it or not. It was about what it revealed. Her words had peeled back the curtain on elitism too long hidden behind polished speeches, and Crockett's response had illuminated the possibility of something better. A politics that spoke not down to people, but with them. Across college campuses, students replayed the clip in classrooms, professors holding it up as a case study in rhetoric, Indignity under fire. Community groups screened it during meetings, treating it like a motivational speech. Churches referenced it in sermons about standing firm in the face of arrogance. The ripple effect was everywhere, and for many watching at home, it wasn't just about politics at all. It was personal. People remembered the times they had been told to go back somewhere, back to school, back to the kitchen, back to their country. They remembered the sting, the humiliation, and seeing Crockett refuse to shrink, seeing her rise instead with poise and clarity, felt like vindication. It felt like healing. The chamber that day had been one stage, but the true arena was the nation's living rooms, its phones, its conversations. And in that arena, Crockett had already won. Her words traveled faster than Pelosi's decades of speeches ever had, carried not by party machinery but by the power of people sharing, reposting and declaring, "This is what we've been waiting for." Pelosi, once the queen of narrative control, suddenly found herself the subject of ridicule, her authority mocked, her arrogance exposed in meme form. For someone who had spent a lifetime crafting an image of control, it was a blow more devastating than any legislative defeat. And yet, as the laughter rolled on, as the memes multiplied, something else lingered beneath it all. Beyond the jokes, beyond the hashtags, beyond the late-night punchlines, there was a deeper resonance, a message that spoke to America's soul. Yet beneath the laughter and memes lay something deeper, a message America needed to hear. In the days that followed, the noise of social media began to settle into something more lasting, something deeper. The jokes and the memes were still there, but what endured was not comedy, it was clarity. Jasmine Crockett's words had transcended the moment. What had begun as an insult had been reframed into a universal truth. Dignity will always rise above arrogance, and resilience will always outlast elitism. Crockett herself leaned into that truth. In interviews, she didn't wallow in victimhood, nor did she trade insult for insult. Instead, she reframed the exchange as a lesson, not just for politics, but for the country. "This isn't about me," she explained. "It's about what kind of America we're choosing to build. Do we silence the voices of the next generation, or do we finally listen? Do we cling to arrogance, or do we embrace dignity?" Her words resonated because they spoke to something larger than partisanship. They tapped into a universal frustration with systems that demand deference but offer little respect. They spoke to workers dismissed by bosses, students belittled by teachers, immigrants mocked for their accents. Crockett's stand became symbolic of a broader struggle, the struggle for every person to claim their rightful place at the table, not as a guest, but as an equal. This, ultimately, was the heart of the lesson. Pelosi's insult had exposed the old model, one where authority was inherited, where dominance was preserved by dismissing others. Crockett's rebuttal revealed the new model, one where authority is earned, where power is validated not by tenure but by truth, where leadership is measured not by who you silence, but by who you uplift. It was a moral reckoning, one that asked America to look inward. Were we a nation that allowed arrogance to masquerade as wisdom? Or were we ready to embrace a future where resilience, authenticity, and dignity carried more weight than age-old entitlement? The question lingered in every headline, every post, every conversation sparked by the exchange. And for millions of Americans, Crockett's calm defiance became proof that change was possible. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't trade venom for venom. She stood her ground, and in doing so, showed that strength is not in shouting down an opponent, but in refusing to be diminished. That kind of strength is contagious. It inspires others to believe that their voices too are worth hearing. The story then was no longer just Pelosi versus Crockett. It became America versus its own reflection, an old way of power, brittle and arrogant, confronted by a new way, rooted in authenticity and resilience. And for the first time, millions watching at home felt the balance shift. The chamber may have returned to order that day, but the lesson did not fade. Crockett had planted something enduring, something bigger than herself. She had shown that dignity could hold its ground against arrogance, that truth could disarm elitism, and that resilience, when rooted in the people, could not be silenced, and for millions watching, one truth became undeniable. It began with an insult, sharp and dismissive. Go back to school. For Nancy Pelosi, it was meant to be the final word, a reminder of her authority, a silencing blow. But instead, it became the spark that lit a fire across the nation. Jasmine Crockett's calm, thunderous response transformed that moment into something unforgettable. A mic drop heard not only in the chamber, but in living rooms, classrooms, and communities across America. What Pelosi intended as a reminder of hierarchy became proof that the old ways of arrogance no longer hold the same power. What she delivered as a put-down became a platform for Crockett to rise, to speak with clarity and dignity, and to embody the voice of a generation that refuses to be silenced. This story was never just about two lawmakers. It was about the deeper battle over who gets to speak, who gets to lead, and who gets to define America's future. Crockett showed us that dignity outweighs arrogance, that resilience crushes elitism, and that truth, when spoken with conviction, cannot be ignored. And so the lesson lingers. We all face moments where someone tries to belittle us, to push us aside, to tell us we don't belong. But Crockett's response stands as proof. You can hold your ground, you can answer with dignity, and you can turn their insult into your anthem. If you believe in dignity over arrogance, if you believe voices like Jasmine Crockett's matter, then share this story. Subscribe to this channel, add your voice to the movement, and let's remind the world. Arrogance fades, but truth endures. Because in the end, this wasn't just a debate. It was America speaking through Jasmine Crockett, loud, clear, and undeniable.